Well, I would highly contest the ability to sort of feel the energy, but that's just my very anti-spiritual atheistic brain. I have noticed that particularly those in my life who do characterize themselves as being like an emotional sponge, that these people tend to be like, they tend to get along with people quite well, but the way that it seems like they get along with people is by like mimicking or like mirroring someone's sort of outward presentation. So my thoughts on being that kind of like emotional sponge is that you do just tend to mirror people quite a bit, and it is something that people do, like in psychology, in order to build rapport with others. You you mirror kind of the outward presentation of the other person to sort of build rapport, but also it does lead you to expressing the same sort of emotion as the other person in your voice or on your body or in your face. And there is like a two-way mechanism that goes on there. Emotions have a feed into how you look and how you express, but also the other way around as well. So it's like when people say, well, if you smile for a while, you will feel a tiny bit better. And there is some level of truth to that. It definitely does like have a sort of a reverse feedback as well. This says Dr. Kim Sage, highly sensitive people and autism, the HSP Profile of Autism, CPTSD and ASD series. Let's get into it.
80% of autistic females are undiagnosed. 80%. That's the number I've come across in several locations. And this whole inquiry I'm doing on trying to understand the overlap and relationship between complex PTSD and autism is becoming more and more difficult, as it really does appear. In the next video I'm going to make on this topic is going to be a comparison of ASD and CPTSD. And even when I look at the different graphs and the other work of people, the more and more I read, the more this overlap continues to sort of show itself around complex trauma and autism. And nowhere is that.
I actually did a podcast with probably one of my favorite creators out there. If you haven't seen them before on Instagram, they're called Neurodivergent Insights. Highly recommend checking out their stuff. They are like a registered psychologist. I think they've got a doctorate or professorship or something. I've had them on the podcast before, and I've been on theirs to talk about alexithymia. One of the interesting things about the podcast that we did, we talked about CPTSD and autism. And it does seem that CPTSD, although I don't know if it's necessarily confirmed, I guess, to be a diagnosis, but I know that a lot of psychologists and stuff do talk about this kind of occurrence. And CPTSD is like, it's a little bit, obviously a little bit more complex than like PTSD that people would get from particular like traumatic things that's happened in their life. But with CPTSD, it tends to be a lot more transient and like consistent sort of small traumas, I suppose. I think that's the best way of explaining it. It does seem that autistic people tend to struggle a little bit more with that kind of thing. We do tend to be a little bit more sensitive sensory wise, sometimes not being able to sort of advocate for ourselves or protect ourselves in particular circumstances due to our social differences. So there is an interesting kind of crossover with that, and I'll have to check out that other video at some point, definitely.
That really more clear in this debate, and it is still a debate about whether or not the highly sensitive person is actually just a profile of a type of autism versus it being a separate thing.
That's what we want
to know.
And
I don't fully know where all this lands, although I can tell you that what I'm going to share with you today is going to come from the autism side, the autism argument around highly sensitive people actually being just a type of profile more often than not of autism. That being said, sensitivity, or HSPs, often called sensory processing sensitivities, that's the sort of clinical term, SPS, are people who have a higher responsiveness to their environment, to the sensory world, a sensitivity.
I didn't know it was called HPS. I'm pretty sure it's SPD. Some within the medical literature, sensory processing disorder. I know that there's a lot of people who like to characterize it as something else. I can't remember what because with the autistic community, we do like to relabel language that is particularly negative. I think with sensory differences, an argument could be made for the positives that come along with our differences sensory wise. So it makes sense. What was the other one that people were talking about? Pathological demand avoidance. Yeah, a persistent drive for autonomy. That's how people have sort of characterized it as. 80% sounds right. Yeah, that seems like a lot. I wonder how they go about getting those numbers. It must be, maybe there's some kind of statistical test that they can use to get around it.
If you will, to sort of everything inside and outside their world. And that this exists, it's a trait, and it exists along a spectrum, and it exists in animals and different species, it's everywhere. Up to 30% apparently of those they've studied can have this trait. It's a sensitivity trait. So that being said, I think that is one thing as we're talking about autism, because for me, one of the biggest issues is how do I understand and make sense of my sensory issues as they have existed my entire life as it relates to complex PTSD, specifically around issues like hypervigilance and what we can see are true sensory sensitivities that we may have developed over time because we're living in fight or flight, because it made sense to make meaning of these things. Maybe we're just, we were more sensitive at birth and we're also experiencing complex trauma. It gets complicated. But what I will say is
that there is a really kind of sort of interesting aspect of autism, which I do touch on quite a bit, called alexithymia. It's difficulty identifying, categorizing your own emotions. It's very, very, very high in autistic people. I think I've seen it as high as 90% in some of the research studies that I've read. It's also really, really high in people who have PTSD as well. And we know from the statistics that we do tend to experience kind of a disproportionate amount of negative life things. It kind of begs the question, is being alexithymic a part of being autistic, or is it just a consequence of us being autistic and having these experiences in life that can sort of produce CPTSD or PTSD? Very interesting question. I'll have to probably DM Megan Neff and see what she thinks of that.
That from the autistic voices I've been listening to, both on videos and TikToks and in research and articles and websites, is that their position is that
that is a really, really, really good thing. I'm really glad that she does that. Thank you, Kim, for integrating the autistic community into your understanding of autism. That is awesome.
The research done by Elaine Aron on highly sensitive people has some issues with it, with this regard. Number one, apparently that she based a large part of her sort of understanding and creating this profile of a person based on two of her grandnephews who were later diagnosed as autistic. So apparently, observing them really informed at least this passion and interest. Now, I've read that several places. I can't seem to find an exact quote from her, but I have seen that many places. The next thing is that when they did do apparently some comparison studies between autism and HSPs, they did not use highly masked, what we would call level 1, low support needs autistics. Basically people who would have been hard to detect without expertise that they may have been on the spectrum, especially because of the very limited way in which the DSM-5 and research has hyper-focused on very specific populations of white males and really disregarded people of color and women. So that's one thing. If the criteria are about this thing, but it leaves out all of us who don't fit in this box, that seems to be an issue. And lastly, that Elaine Aron herself had said that the two biggest reasons why they weren't the same thing initially were that one, people with autism don't tend to have empathy, which is absolutely not true. I'm going to make a video.
Yeah, 100%. 100% not true. It's a very, very, very subtle kind of difference. Autistic people in general definitely do show like normal, if not higher levels of empathy, just due to like the negative experiences and experiences as a different person that we can have. But we do tend to struggle a little bit when it comes to interpreting indirect communication. So like a lot of people, they might be able to sort of deduce, I guess, how someone is feeling based on sort of outward characteristics, the body language, the facial expressions, the way that they're talking, what they're talking about, and say like, oh, okay, they're in that sort of certain emotion. Whereas for us, we can sometimes find it a little bit more difficult, especially like in a really highly pressured social environment. So it's a subtle difference, you know, and I see it a lot, or saw it a lot when I was teaching, you know, particularly with autistic children would, you know, accidentally injure or upset another child, but they just wouldn't sort of pay them any attention because they didn't know. But as soon as they knew, as soon as attention had been drawn to that, they're like over the top empathizing. Like it's really lovely to see, and it's nice to also see like when I'm reading about it and through my own experience and have that like confirmed like in reality. It's really, really cool.
About what's called the double empathy problem, which really gets into understanding what empathy looks like in those with autism. And in fact, it's highly offensive to assume that they don't. Many of them have hyper empathy. There's a wide degree there of those, and how they might not only experience empathy, but how it might be understood as the person is experiencing it. So it's not true that those who have autism don't have empathy. And secondly, that those with autism have special interests, which apparently is not always true either. And that those with HSP traits wouldn't have special interests. And so once again, we're learning as I'm going through this, so many voices are informing my views. And I want to say this, that I am trying to use, of course, those who have written books and done research studies, but I also am trying to listen to those who are frankly very impressive and have done a lot of their own research, who are not necessarily in academia, but who are people who have very powerful and worthwhile autistic voices to listen to. So I'm going to be pulling from lots of things as I try to understand everything. And because even if I try to only stick to the most research dynamics, if the DSM-5 that creates that understanding of a diagnosis is missing a lot of data, is inaccurate, has presumed some things that aren't true, has left out populations, we have a serious problem. And that's what I'm learning more and more. And that's why this blend is becoming stronger, as it appears that it's relatively, you know, an inherent part of autism can be to also experience complex trauma in many forms. So
again, like, just have to highlight this, like, if you have ever like gone on a hunt trying to find like a competent sort of psychologist or someone, you know, like a counselor or someone like that, it's really, really good for them to have obviously like the basis of knowledge and research and practical experience. But if you can find somebody as well who is just like who has this kind of mentality, who doesn't sort of hold this level of, well, not this level, but that level of I don't know, I'm trying to think of another word other than narcissism. Perhaps not narcissism. Arrogance, I guess, in sort of the face of like real people's experiences. Usually that's quite a sort of a red flag for me when it comes to try and find, you know, some worthwhile to sort of engage with in a very, very sort of intimate space. So it's really great to hear as well that someone online is, you know, obviously done their PhD, put a lot of work into it, but is also, you know, continuing to learn and also be aware of the flaws in like the psychiatric system. So really cool.
So let's talk about what the HSP profile of autism looks like in the autistic community. I'm going to be referencing actually a TikTok. I'm going to link it down below, by an individual named Dr. Joey, who has two doctorates, one in clinical psychology and one, I believe, in clinical neuropsychology. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what they both are. And in that TikTok, they go through what the profile would look like. Now, I would encourage you to go back to my last video if you want and just look at the typical criteria, on what makes a person an HSP. You could quickly Google it on your phone and just look at the characteristics. It really is about heightened emotional sensitivities, heightened empathy, heightened sensory responses to, like I said earlier, everything basically inside and outside of your world and how that impacts you.
Lots of things that are also pretty common for people on the autism spectrum.
So if that were to instead be a profile of a type of autism, what I'm reading is that would reflect a person who would, let's say, identify as an HSP, who was unconsciously masking, who might also be highly masking in a way that they don't even know they have autism, but they have learned to make all of these adaptations because they have enough ability to understand certain types of social dynamics so that they know that having a meltdown wouldn't be appropriate, for example, to show that they were so dysregulated, let's say, inside by something in a sensory way that they might go home and then shut down for the rest of the night, but they're not going to necessarily show that to you in what we have thought of as more of an autistic type of
Well, meltdowns aren't necessarily like something that you can control, but you can definitely like modify like the amount of interaction that you're having with people, or like go to the bathroom or like something like that. But I wouldn't say that you necessarily have that control, I guess, over whether you have a meltdown or not. It is, you know, I'm just trying in my head to think about like why like it could be different, because a lot of the things that I have read around HSP definitely like scream like autism, like in pretty much every part that I've looked at. It's interesting. As I said, like I never really sort of heard or knew about it until one of you guys chimed up about it. It's funny that when neurotypical people fail to empathize with autistics, they claim we lack empathy. Yeah, well that's the whole idea about like the double empathy problem, isn't it? It's like it's going to be difficult to empathize with somebody who's got a different brain to you, a different way of being. I think as well another aspect to that kind of empathy thing is definitely like it's definitely the indirect communication aspect of it, which has been characterized as what people deem as adaptive empathy. And I don't tend to use that a lot because people do get the wrong end of the stick when I say adaptive empathy. Cognitive empathy, what am I talking about?
Behavior. So basically the profile reflects an emotional oversensitivity and is about unconscious masking. And that as a result of all of this, as I go through it, it talks about this profile especially being especially at risk for burnout. And burnout is basically, from my understanding, I'm going to also do a whole video on this, where for many people who've been masking their whole lives and just like literally treading water to adjust and survive without drowning, that at some point it is so much that it basically forces a person at times to really lose capacity, to shut down, to become significantly overwhelmed in a way that affects functioning. And so you can imagine if, let's say, you are identifying with being a highly sensitive person, which I always have, right? That would explain the things that complex trauma wouldn't necessarily explain. And maybe it is. Maybe these are separate things. And HSP explains that with CPTSD, that I came out of the womb where you did sensitive. And then we landed in a very invalidating environment again and again and again. At the same time, when you start to kind of compare and overlap the profile of autism, especially at the core, which is so much about our sensory sensitivities, in fact, even more so than social communication dynamics, because what we're learning is that it's not a deficit to be autistic, a social deficit that you might have, your communication style. It is a difference.
Again, really great to hear from like a psychological professional. That is so nice to hear. Oh yes, I was going to talk about high masking. For anyone who doesn't know, masking it's a component of social camouflage which covers, you know, 3 main areas. I did do a video on it, so I won't go too much in detail. But masking is the element where you try to hide particular sort of outward traits that you have as an autistic person. And it can be things like your facial expression, sort of body language, as well as like how much eye contact you make. It's particularly like talked about quite a bit. When you come across somebody who has lived their life masking for such a long time, and masking, when I say that, it does take into account the sort of the assimilation and compensatory mechanisms. It takes up a lot of energy, and it also can lead people to, I guess, sort of feeling a little bit disillusioned with the social landscape that they have, the people that they're close friends with. Sometimes they're not necessarily friends with them, they feel, and more this kind of mask that you're putting on. And people don't always know that, not everybody masks. They think it's just kind of a normal part of sort of people socializing together. You will kind of come together and you do this, and just me particularly, I really struggle to sort of maintain it a lot of the time. And it's in a very, 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 very exhausting process. 100%, and that's why we have things like burnout sort of occurring quite a bit. So if you imagine your typical social situation, there's already a lot going on. You're having to kind of read the other person, express yourself, understand what they're saying, think about what you're going to say, adding in aspects of monitoring how you're looking and how you're saying stuff and how much eye contact you're having. It gives a lot of mental traffic, 100%. It's like trying to multitask basically. And so social environments and conversations that you have can be infinitely more, not infinitely, but exponentially more draining than it would be if you were just yourself.
So you need to hold space for the idea that an autistic brain does not fit into the box of all the social worlds and all the social rules that have been constructed that said this is right and this is wrong and this is how we make a diagnosis. It doesn't make space for the fact that on this world and this planet, maybe we speak this language, but on this planet we speak that language, and neither one is wrong or right. And that also applies, as I mentioned, to the idea of empathy, that the way people might engage with each other, who, let's say, two autistic people versus two non-autistic people. There might be, and I think the research shows that there's something that's happening with, let's say, two of the same that tend to have a better way of understanding each other, potentially,
100%.
than, let's say, a different, an autistic person and a non-autistic person. So. And
they have actually, they've done studies. I do talk about this study quite a bit. Again, but they had 3 groups of people sort of trying to communicate together to do a team task together. When they had neurotypicals and autistic people in a group with each other, they performed equally well on both of them. When they mixed them together, however, that's when difficulties in terms of communication tended to arise. So it's interesting, and I have thought about the different, I guess, social rules that we can have as autistic people. I find that most of the time we do tend to explain a lot of things rather than necessarily express them. So if we're having a tough time, then we might be perhaps a little bit more likely to sort of talk about it and explain how we feel and why, rather than necessarily express that in the way that we say things. And also the actual kind of back and forth, the conversation with neurotypicals, it tends to be very blended, between so what one person speaking, another person pitches in, and then another person pitches in and changes it, and it's kind of this like a ping pong game, table tennis game. With autistic people, it's more like that game that you would play as a very, very young child at school, where you have the talking ball, and you sit in a circle, and when you hold the talking ball, you're allowed to speak, and when you're not supposed to speak. It's kind of like that, and we pass the ball to each other when the other person is finished speaking, and I like that. I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty cool.
These are the characteristics. Number 1, an intensity and depth of processing that reflects a rich and complex inner life and may manifest as complex imagery or deep theorizing about the world and people. And don't forget that for many people who are highly masking or autistic in general, one of their special interests is often people. That is the idea of it being psychology, like I mentioned, in the arts, if your special interest is understanding how humans are supposed to be in situations, you might become much better at that than someone whose interest was not that.
That's definitely where I started off. It's like, how do these crazy people, how do I understand neurotypicals? I find them really interesting. So I'm kind of like a reverse autism researcher, researching normal people.
But the way it might manifest, which is this common thing in HSPs, having a deep interior world, that would be true, and it would look like this complex imagery and deep thinking about the world and yourself and others. Number 2, a high sensitivity to sensory input. So basically what we're saying is the HSP profile of autism would be very sensitive to things like pain, hunger, touch, fabrics, clutter, temperature, having a strong startle response, sensations, light, smells, and theirs and other people's intense emotions. So everything around the senses, the volume would be very high up, which is also true for HSPs.
Interesting. Wouldn't say that I fit all of those, but definitely when it comes to like sharp pain and most things other than like my vestibular proprioceptive input, so rides and things like that, don't really affect me. I don't have a strong startle response. I have like an underactive one, I think. It's probably because of my experience as a combat athlete, but...
Number 3, a high perceptivity in picking up things that other people don't. So that's like being able to kind of like focus on things that others might not notice. Number 4, needing accommodations for your sensitivities. But then again, if you were basically unconsciously masking, so you're an HSP autistic, but you don't know that, you're unconsciously masking and making all these adjustments in the world to show up in a certain way to get through it. But maybe you do things without realizing it, like you only buy clothing without tags. You only can use certain kind of perfumes or smells. So you basically set up your world through what you're thinking are preferences, but really they're ways of kind of accommodating for basically what are difficult triggers for you potentially.
Like sensory adjustments that you kind of make around the house, Might decide to get like a little bit of a less bright light maybe in your room. Might get a dimmer switch, just as a preference, It's not a sensory accommodation.
Essentially. Number 5, needing advanced notice to prepare for sensory sensitivities. And we've talked a lot about the HSP world being highly reactive to stress, that let's say unpredictable situations, things we can't control, that all of that would make it more difficult. So the idea is that oftentimes those who have autism will say, if I know what to expect going into it, I tend to do well. And I think that's true for most of us. I think especially we all have, wherever we are in terms of our brains, have little things we like and don't like. And being like surprised by something we don't enjoy or like, most of us don't do well with that. It's just a matter of degree. And I would say for those who have heightened sensitivities, that would be the case.
It's the same as with like RSD and stuff. It's like, when you start talking about RSD, it's like, people say, well, everyone doesn't like failure and rejection. It's all about like the intensity of it with things like this.
Fine sense, taste, sounds, smells, art, things like that. And that's another one of the signs of HSPs. It's this appreciation for the beauty of life, right? For this like parts of beauty and enjoyment for the sake of what they are, like an awareness of that, a sensitivity to that, an appreciation for that. Number 7, hyperempathy with a tendency to be easily affected by others' moods. Now we know that's also part of HSP. So, and also complex trauma. We learn to pay a lot of attention to what other people are doing and thinking and feeling, and we can take that and absorb that. And in fact, there are those on the spectrum who have hyperempathy, I think, as I said earlier. So when you're hyperempathic, there's no barrier. The volume is way up. And where there should ideally be a barrier, there isn't one. And I've talked about this a lot, but I am so affected by my kids' moods that even when I can in my head say, I know this is not anything to do with me, if they're in the back room and they're in a bad mood, it still bothers me. And I can feel the energy, and this is a good thing.
Well, I would highly contest the ability to sort of feel the energy, but that's just my very anti-spiritual atheistic brain. I have noticed that particularly those in my life who do characterize themselves as being like an emotional sponge, that these people tend to be like they tend to get along with people quite well, but the way that it seems like they get along with people is by like mimicking or like mirroring someone's sort of outward presentation. So my thoughts on being that kind of like emotional sponge is that you do just tend to mirror people quite a bit. And it is something that people do, like in psychology, in order to build rapport with others. It's, you mirror kind of the outward presentation of the other person to sort of build rapport. But also it does lead you to expressing the same sort of emotion as the other person in your voice or on your body or in your face. And there is like a two-way mechanism that goes on there. Emotions have a feed into how you look and how you express, but also the other way around as well. So it's like when people say, oh, if you smile for a while, you will feel a tiny bit better. And there is some level of truth to that. It definitely does like have a sort of a reverse feedback as well into how you feel. If you imagine you're mirroring somebody, you're putting on these emotions, you're feeling quite sort of happy and calm. Someone's coming feeling really angry and sort of dysregulated and irritated. It's going to have a feedback on you as well, especially if you're mirroring that.
As a therapist and psychologist, to be able to read people, and of course working online is required a few shifts in that, but it's still, if you're an energy reader, you know what I mean, and that is also a sign of HSP. The next one is a strong desire to be ethical. So apparently, and what I'm learning about autism is that it's not necessarily a sense to be moral, but it's about a strong sense of justice, of what is right and wrong. And that would align too with HSPs in that they wouldn't be necessarily great or down with, being unsupportive of a different, community or of not accepting others. There's a lot about, or fighting for what seems like is fair and right, although I think it would be even stronger, I'm guessing, for a person with autism.
Yeah.
Difficulties working under pressure.
I think it's very dependent on what that person thinks about the world and thinks is like they consider to be right or wrong or fair or not, because it varies a lot person to person. And for one person, they might have a whole different sort of set of things that they think is right or fair than another person. Like I've seen some unfavorable videos out there which were talking about like bullying is good. Bullying is supposed to be, it's something that really gets you to change and grow up or man up and stuff like that. Absolute rubbish. But you have someone who thinks that perhaps this thing is just, it's just tempering them for the life ahead. Whereas another person, most people would say that it's probably not a good thing. Like, it's probably pretty bad on the person's sort of mental health, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they will grow from it in a productive way. Even so, like, not a nice thing to do. But people do have their own, like, personal feelings and thoughts and sort of code of ethics, perhaps, which may not necessarily align with what most people think. So it's very, very dependent on the person, I would say.
Sure. Now that's obviously would be expected. Anybody who has high sensitivities, that stress is such a major impactor of our well-being. And that's definitely true for HSPs and would be true for the HSP profile of autism. Also
just true in general for autistic people. Like, I think anxiety is one of the highest, like, co-occurring things, other than, like, ADHD, perhaps, and alexithymia, of course.
Difficulties with conflict. Now, it just seems to reason that if you're a highly sensitive person, for whatever reason, the world feels intense and things hurt more and feels the edges are sharper, that you wouldn't necessarily like conflict. You wouldn't like negative feelings. You wouldn't like places where it doesn't feel safe. And those are true for both. Passionate about topics. So interest in psychology, the self, the environment. One of the things I think is about animals in terms of the HSPs, but it would be like this interest in things that are meaningful and the way it would look.
It's really, really interesting that kind of like talking about, I wonder amongst like the people that I know, just trying to think about it, who are, quite highly masked individuals, what are their interests like? Are they like into psychology and stuff. I mean, it kind of does, you know, make sense, I suppose, but I think also to a certain point when you are looking into like the human condition, thinking about like how people work, that you would indeed have quite a heavy amount of self-reflection in that. So I don't necessarily know. Maybe it might be just if you have like a sort of transient interest in psychology and like reading up about it and stuff, but I don't know necessarily. I wonder what I'll have to do, like a poll maybe.
Looking at an autistic profile, as I said earlier, is a passion about people and how their brains work or their emotions work, or maybe love for those who are, you know, let's say an endangered animal species, things like that. So that would obviously go further, but of course a person with a classic sensitivity profile in general would be more likely to care about others and experiences and interactions and things like that. Number 12 is susceptibility to headaches, body aches, gastrointestinal issues emerging from stress. So as we know with HSPs in that profile, in terms of the classic one, that they are going to be more sensitive to things, and those things are going to manifest in their bodies and come out in different symptoms.
It's a lot to do with cortisol levels. I used to have really bad GI difficulties when I was younger. Now that I'm like, I've found sort of a reasonable, like, I don't want to call it a stack, 'cause it sounds like I'm doing like a supplement stack, but a medication stack where my levels of anxiety and depression are somewhat reasonable for me living life. I don't necessarily have many of those issues, and it's interesting kind of thinking about how anxiety, you know, might influence someone developing depression, because we know that like people who are depressed tend to experience negativity, painful, chronic kind of experiences which they don't feel like they can escape from. It tends, you know, a lot to do with like this idea of the HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal. It's related to like hormones and stuff like that. But also, when it comes to anxiety and stress, the cortisol definitely does affect your gut, and your gut has its, you know, its own microbiome, and it's really interesting. I mean, it's a bit of a side topic, I suppose, but your microbiome, like the amount of genetic DNA of bacteria in your gut, far supersedes like the amount of human DNA that you have in your body, which is interesting. But there is definitely like a kind of what people describe as like a second brain in your gut. There is a lot of communication between your gut and like your brain. It's actually one of the places that produces a lot of like serotonin. It's why if you take like the supplement, the tablets that proceed serotonin. But there's a tablet, there's a supplement that you can take which definitely like impacts your level of serotonin, and it does that because the bacteria in your gut convert it into serotonin. So it's really interesting thinking about like the mind, the brain gut axis as well, and how, you know, perhaps, you know, long-term anxiety can sort of influence someone developing depression. I think I studied behavior and body language for like 5 years just on my own. I feel that same. You know, like I used to sort of write about my experiences with neurotypicals. I used to make like notes on my phone, like save them. I probably still have like all of my notes saved. Some of them were just completely unhinged notes, and I didn't understand the situation at all. Some of them quite informative on like both my experiences, but also, you know, how like neurotypicals worked from my perspective. I personally think that highlighting autism too much further divides society's outlook of the binary system rather than a spectrum, which is what it is. So keep up the work, but strike the balance. IMO. Yeah, I understand what you mean. I think the issue is whenever someone or anyone talks about like a specific group of people, you're obviously going to generalize to quite a large extent. And the thing is with psychological diagnoses in general is that, you know, they're based on traits that you can see, that you can like monitor and say like, okay, this is a trait, that this type of person that we've characterized has. So there is always that kind of sense of grey area. I do try to talk about that as much as I can, but it's very difficult to sort of talk broadly and generally about something without, you know, doing exactly that. It's a mega autistic characteristic to discuss serious subjects before bed. Yeah, just get into a whole sort of dive into your own psyche and the philosophy of life and other complex issues before you sleep. It's probably because we're like out of routine, you know. We're in the relaxation stage of the evening, and our brain's like, ooh, gotta stay active, gotta stay thinking about things.
And that the idea is that stress would be a major driver for both the HSP and the HSP profile of autism. Number 13, difficulties are as a result of masking unconsciously and often expressed through other means such as health or mental health issues. So even though, let's say, a person with this profile who has autism is trying to do a good job of masking, it's requiring them to really sacrifice and manage and deal with all of this, like, as I said kind of last time, the nails in the chalkboard all of the time while maybe not showing it. And so that might manifest in an anxiety disorder, depression, all types of issues where that might come up, or your own health issues, as we know that chronic stress is significantly related to the onset of adult issues around, you know, as I've talked about so many cases in the ACEs studies and the adverse childhood experiences studies, where we said that those who had more childhood trauma tended to have more physical health issues as well as mental health issues. And then the last...
There is a lot of crossover when it comes to stuff like that. It's not always... Because your brain is like an organ, and we tend to... I tend to at some points like forget that. Like it's genuinely like an organ that we have. It's not this kind of ephemeral spiritual kind of thing. It is affected by things going on in our bodies as well. Oh, we're going for some British slangs. What can I think of, like a Yorkshire saying? Gonna pop to shop in it. Blood. Fam. That's a good one.
Last one is that the neurobiology of HSP autistics reflects an intensity of sensory processing that is consistent with autism research. So it's really more about, according to Dr. Joey and the research that they pulled together, and other people that I actually also read, that it's really about the sensory processing more than about deficits in social functioning. As I said earlier, it's not that autistic people have a deficit, it's a difference. And so if the world you were taught to speak, the language was this language, but people over here could speak that language, of course, you would not be doing a good job in this one. And so the problem is that the deficits in social functioning in autism have now been disputed by the double empathy problem. And I'm going to make a whole video about that. The bottom line about that is that it's sort of like how you're assessing empathy depends on who's having the empathic dynamic, right? Yeah. So it's that maybe neurotypicals would expect it to look like this or experience it this way, and those who are neurodiverse would experience it another way. One is not right or wrong, they're just different. And so...
Well, when it comes to things like confrontation as well, I think something that she mentioned, like 100%, like sometimes when you're autistic, like the best thing is to kind of take a step back from things which are quite sort of emotionally heavy, whereas some people might expect you to sort of produce a response or like react to how they're feeling or what they're saying sort of on the spot, which, you know, sometimes we do need that time to kind of, you know, if not only for like shifting through the alexithymic haze, and so like people's, you know, people might characterize that kind of behavior as perhaps being dismissive or avoidant, whereas for us it might just be quite a normal useful thing for us to do, to kind of take a step back.
So the stereotypes that are blocking HSPs from being diagnosed might be that they are just really autistics who are masking alongside a stereotype that says that, you know, and not just a stereotype, a reality that being diagnosed with autism might bring some negative things into your life. It might bring some great things as well. But at this current time, there can be some things that could hold you back from, for example. And then even things like stimming, which we think of as a traditionally autistic behavior, that those who have HSP profiles might also be trying to find ways to deal with their overloaded sensitivities, like picking their skin or twirling their hair, or singing, things like that. Or
yeah, well, I mean, everybody stims, well, most people stim to some degree. It's only really called or characterized as stimming because autistic people tend to have very, very different stims. And I think that that's heavily to do with our different sensory profiles. You know, things are going to be a lot more large in terms of like movements or things that we do because, you know, our sensory systems are a lot different. But yeah, I mean, there's things like clicking a pen or like biting your nails or something. Like, a lot of people do that, and they're not necessarily autistic.
Or going through thoughts in their mind over and over again and reflecting. That it's really about regulating the sensory triggers and not so much about just the idea of repetitive behaviors for the sake of repetitive behaviors. And so we know that those, for example, with trauma might find ways to turn the nervous systems to manage those things as well through what might look like different types of stimming. And I think historically we've thought of stimming as hand flapping, rocking, which of course it is.
I just say trauma creates neurodiversity. What? I think it can create some neurodiversities, but not for the sort of inherently, you know, things that are dictated by like the structure of our brain from birth. Interesting point.
But that there are lots of ways that those with autism might, you know, enjoy stims and might use to regulate, to deal with stress, to deal with whatever's going on, and input into their world. So
the joyful aspects of it we would call sensory joy. It's not a very scientific term. The stimming thing, it tends to be repetitive things that we do over and over again to self-regulate, which obviously like you would do if you were feeling negative. Maybe not so much if you're in a good mood, but there are some good things about being autistic. Sometimes our sensory systems are heightened in certain ways, and it can make experiencing life a lot more varied, different, stronger, more pleasurable in some respects, I would say. But yeah, the regulatory element of stimming is like really, really important. It's something that I've actually had to teach myself to do again in adulthood. Definitely like been suppressing it. Not because of my parents, actually. They never stopped me from doing that, but it was my own sort of masking in childhood, which sort of got rid of my stimming.
Bottom line is that all of this profile, when you look at what I've read, and you think about 80% of females being undiagnosed who have autism, that is a strikingly horrific number to think about. And whether we're just,
bad.
you know, want to label this, okay, you know, because technically HSPs are neurodivergent, just like autism creates a neurodivergent profile. Whatever it is, complex trauma is a neurodivergent profile. Our brains have to make these changes to accommodate for whatever's going on, whether we're born with it or it happens to us inherently. And so what I think is powerful about this is understanding that if you relate to this profile of being highly sensitive, even if you just want to say, I'm not willing to go into the autistic dynamic at this point, although it's pretty interesting when you listen to autistic voices, how much you hear that, is to really acknowledge how profoundly impactful the world is to you. And I've been noticing this more and more, and I'm not sure if it's because I haven't had a vacation in 2 years, which is is changing soon.
Jeez.
But I'm finding it harder and harder to tolerate certain things. And my nervous system is getting more and more just depleted. And then you add in things like menopause, where, as I've said, I'm up at 4 a.m. every day, and that's a whole other conversation. It starts to wear on you. And the idea is that if you've been unconsciously masking your autism and really trying so hard to fit this round shape into this square hole, that at some point it may no longer fit and there might actually be damage from doing so, it's important to understand that however you want to identify, if you just want to call it neurodivergence, that to start to own that you need to think about, because of your sensory sensitivities, for example, how you set up your life. I made a list on my phone. I'm going to make a video about this. I couldn't believe it. This was like actually before I even did this deep dive. about how many things I set up in my life, in my home, to deal with my sensory triggers. And the list was like this long, from like how I deal with smells, how I deal with fabrics, how I, do routines, candles, lighting, like it's so much. And it's just how I am. And that goes back to what my daughter would said, God, everything bothers you. It's like my attempt to reduce the harm of being bothered. And that is what I think masking looks like. When you're trying so hard to reduce the harm to yourself, it is still harm. And so if you leave these videos just thinking about how to, change.
And as well, like, generally, like, being a high masker for a large period of time definitely does have, impacts as well. Like, it can sometimes be like a protective kind of thing that you do to avoid negative situations, but it also comes with a lot of energy depletion, a lot of negative things alongside, like the actual act of masking.
To honor the way your brain works, and that's as far as you're willing to go. That to me is profoundly impactful, and it will require that you change some things for yourself, or what I'm finding is that your brain will change it for you. And it might manifest in burnout, in raging anxiety, which I think many people with autism have in general, but in ways that actually prohibit your functioning. I've actually started to change my filming schedule and my patient schedule I'm working on as the summer's going on, because I keep trying to fit everything in. And that's also why I don't have the specific days of when I'm posting videos. I'm trying to post at least 4, if not 5.
Wow.
Because it was stressing me out with that schedule so much that it was like not making me wanting to do it, which is a whole other conversation. But anyway, the point is everything from how you do your sleep, to how you nourish your body, to exercise, to how you engage in relationships or not, to your isolating or not, like all of that might need to be more protected if you begin to identify and understand that you do have these sensitivities.
It's really difficult as well. It's quite depressing when, because you have kind of two schools of thoughts, I think. I feel like, obviously there are a lot more and it's a lot more nuanced, but there are some people who say that, resilience and like, dealing with things is an important thing to do. And I do agree to some extent with that. And then you have other people who, they're like, okay, I'm a different person. And so, some things I can say that I don't want to deal with, and other things, I can, and that's all good, and that's fine. I think it is definitely sad to see, like, I think, like, some particular influencers or people online saying that, like, depression doesn't exist, and, if you take medications and you're weak and all that kind of stuff. But really, like, understanding that you're a different person is quite an, like, important part of that like story, because not everybody experiences life in the same way, and especially when it comes to autism, or it comes to like sensory differences, or particularly sensitivities to things. It's not necessarily that you are just a weak person and that everybody deals with like the same intensity of life as you do. Everyone does have differences, and I'm sure that people who aren't necessarily very sensitive and they're quite like stoic and they can deal with a lot of things, I'm sure if they were born in with a different kind of high sensitivity to things, that they'd probably feel the same about things.
And you do need the support. So I hope that was helpful. I'm curious to see what you think. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Very interesting video. That was Dr. Kim Sage, Highly Sensitive People and Autism. HSP Profile of Autism. Very interesting video. We'll have to watch her video on HSP and like the different facets of it at some other point in time, because it was very interesting, and I'm pretty sure that entire video was like one cut. Like, very much in awe of their presentational abilities if they've managed to do that. Absolutely crazy. But what are you guys chatting about? Yes, we are all acoustic here. Dr. Kim Sage and Onion Crisps. Oh my god. making me chuckle. I was feeling pretty rubbish like going into this live, but you guys have cheered me up a little bit.